Hello, my name is Alex, and today we'll talk about using satellite imagery for the global monitoring of the food and trying to understand the whole value chain from the food growing to food production to food consumption. So monitoring the food at the global scale is really important because with the growing population and the limited resources for soil and water, we need to better solve the challenges with food production. And we need to understand the whole food production from the one picture. There are commodity crops like cotton, corn, wheat, rice, and sugarcane that impact the whole food production and food consumption in the world. And it may turn out that overproduction in some place and underproduction in other place may cause dramatic problems with not just the food prices, but also the real availability of the food for many countries. It happened a couple years ago with Africa and with the growing prices for the oil and for the energy resources, when it turned out that it's more profitable to grow sugarcane and produce ethanol than to produce the food. And many countries switched all the production of corn and wheat to sugarcane, and it turned out with really dangerous bad hunger, because all the countries producing ethanol, they make money, but literally no food for the whole continent. And to address this problem, it takes some time. And even the international organizations came together trying to solve this problem, and it is solvable, but not within a month and not within a couple of months. So it was a really bad situation. And the good thing that currently it's possible to address the situation with the satellites, because unlike drones and other remote sensing ways to understand the food, they provide lots of massive monitoring up to daily coverage for the whole world with resolution enough to understand the whole world. So most of these data sources are open source, like from NASA and from European Space Agency, and also there are commercial data sources. And altogether, they provide up to daily monitoring with medium resolution data, like moderate, 10 to 30 meters in one pixel. This data is not enough if you want to see a man, or you want to see a car, or you want to see a building, but they're pretty good if you want to see a growing field and understand what's happening with it. And further on, I will talk about this type of data with broad coverage and medium resolution. So this is an example of one project that's not from our company, it's from our colleagues. And they analyzed the archives of the food production for US, and they managed to understand and map and classify the food from within the whole US. And not only to detect what crop is growing on each field, but also see whether it's performing or underperforming. And it's really amazing to see that it is done down to the field level, and it's really possible to understand at pretty high accuracy what's happening. So basically, how do they do? If you just image the one field and see it's like an iPhone camera, you'll probably see that it's green, and the field of another type of crop is green too. But to understand what's happening there, the best way is to repeatedly make the observations and plot the vegetation. And by looking at the vegetation pattern, it's possible to classify crop from crop, because grassland like alfalfa, they usually have a flat plot, which one on the top, and the stretchy foods like soybean, like corn, they have a visible peak on the top of the vegetation season. And by looking at the time series or the part of it, it's possible to classify what crop is growing there, even in the pretty early stages. It's cool to see the whole range, but with 2/3 of it or with half of it, it's also possible to detect. So the first predictions of what is going to be grown and how good is it going is happening starting from June or July in the northern hemisphere, while the harvest is going to happen to September or October. If you go in deeper, so the question is what exactly is being measured. And if we look at the corn so the vegetation for corn being plotted, the best way to understand what exactly is going there and what is the metric that is changing is the spectral response for red and near-infrared spectral bands. Also, green is very helpful. And the majority of the changes happen in a pretty narrow range, and it's possible to equip the satellite camera with specifically this spectral range instead of the whole visible light camera, and understand and see these changes and even quantitate them. So having this information from the red, green, near-infrared, maybe narrow red, narrow yellow, orange, so different bands are equipped with different cameras, but generally the idea is to make the indexes. And many years ago, when only the deterministic methods were available, they invented indexes which are applicable for different crops and different soils and different regions. And currently, it's really easy to use all of these indexes and the values for the raw bands as an input to a model. So basically, the idea is as an observation data, is to stream specifically the different indexes and use them as features. So we talk about the solving a problem. So, and by the problem here, I mean it can be different things. It can be crop classification. It can be soil analysis. It can be moisture detection. It can be prediction of the food production and how good the crop is performing. So all of this breaks onto three large steps. So one is collecting the observation data. And this used to be the challenge for many years, but currently with the satellites and the high resolution data for more important regions, it is doable. So the idea is to stack multiple layers for the data and analyze them as a continuous time series and understand what's going on and what is being changed. The second thing, which is currently the most challenging, is to obtain the ground truth data. For example, for US, USDA collects everything and everything is available. But for other countries, sometimes it's the most challenging to understand, is to even survey what was growing this year, what was growing previous year. And if we go up to 5 years back to history, it's simply impossible to see what was there and how the soil is being used, how the land is being used, and what is the history and what is the archive for this region. And the third part is the method. And by the method, it contains both the algorithms, because depending on the problem and the task, the algorithms can be completely different, and the processing infrastructure, which is a real challenge when we talk about satellite data, because it is pretty bulky. So like if we want to cover 200 kilometers by 200 kilometers square with just a 20-meter data, it requires 10,000 by 10,000 pixels. And it's impossible to compress this data because every pixel is meaningful and every pixel shows some of the spectral response of the crop. So it's really talking about high-load image processing systems. And if we go in deeper to each of the steps, and we are talking about the observation data, the most of it is the optical imagery, radar, weather data, and it's also an interesting thing is like a location-based economic data. And today, like I believe the most useful and like transferable part of my talk is to knowing where to get this data for free and in easy access. And the most longest in the history data set is the Landsat 8 from NASA. It started in 2013, and also there's a legacy of other previous Landsat generations, and it's possible to go back to history up to 1975, if it's, for example, for the analysis of the trees, like of the grapes, of apricots, of almonds. And this data set, it is in 30 meters and 1 pixels. Again, it's a moderate resolution, and it has pretty low temporal frequency, so it's 2 observations per day. And also I need to mention that when we're talking about 2 observations per day, per month, it also assumes that the images are cloudless. In fact, for the growing regions, it's usually always lots of clouds, and like roughly half or 1/3 of the images is only used for the real analysis. Everything else is spoiled by clouds, and the multispectral data cannot go through them, so other data sources are being used. The most interesting and promising data set currently is the European Space Agency Sentinel-2 generation of multispectral images. It has 10 meters in 1 pixel and is frequent as every 5 days. And it has very high radiometric quality, so it's possible not only plot such beautiful pictures, but also to really understand and be confident in every pixel level and understand what is going on and compare pixel to pixel. So it leads us from huge fields of corn and wheat down to high-valued crops like strawberries, like sugarcane. As I said, the multispectral data is challenged by the clouds, so the good way is to help with it is to use the radar data. So Sentinel-1 by ESA is also a very interesting data source because it can look through the clouds and can see the moisture content on the fields and probably use it as a features too. It's less informative, but it's resistant to clouds. All these data sets are available on their native sources, so it's USGS for NASA data and Copernicus for the European Space Agency data. But the good news is that this data is available to downlink the full archives on Amazon and Google. So just a pretty straightforward way to downlink the massive of this data, and sometimes it's even more cost-effective to run your method of processing within these cloud infrastructures too, because it's cheaper to transfer the data, while the cost for just for the transfer, not for reading, not for processing, may be significant. In addition to the open source data, there is a bunch of the new players and some of the traditional players for the commercial satellite data. So they try to be cheap, but they can be primarily used for some narrow specific applications because they are still pretty expensive, but they allow to have the data more frequently, have the better resolution because most of them are high resolution, and also they may have dedicated spectral bands. For example, you need some narrow red for cotton or narrow red for sugarcane, and the satellite can be deployed specifically with this sensor to understand specifically this parameter. As an example of the commercial data sources, I wanted to show an example of the data which is provided by the company I work with. So Astra Digital had a story of building the custom satellite missions for different tasks. So this one mission called Landmapper, the idea was to fill in the gaps between Landsats and Sentinels. And we had a pretty long story of successful and non-successful launches. And currently we have 2 flying satellites that combined with Landsat and Sentinel allow to have the daily coverage. And we're really excited to start doing the agricultural monitoring this year for the first time. The last part of the observation data is the weather data. Again, it is not that informative because when you look at the multispectral picture, you know what's already happening there. Weather explains the conditions, but if using it as a feature, it's helpful and understandable, and also there are both public and commercial but dedicated for the agriculture data, which can be easily streamed and use the one more data layer, which doesn't correlate that much with the growing data. That can be really helpful feature. So the second challenge for the second part of the process of the building the model is to have the ground truth data. And this is currently the most challenging problem because from country to country, from region to region, it is different, and it prevents the scalable and repeatable solutions. Even there's a huge success for US crop mapping, it does not that successful for other regions. So there's a lot of different sources where it's possible for free to collect the data. Some of them are limited to certain regions, some of them is global, some of them directly shows what was produced, how much was it, how much was sold, and the whole value chain for the data, for the food data. Everything else is the economic parameters, which can be used as secondary features and help to improve the accuracy. But generally, the most important data sets are the food growing and food production. So the most useful and easy to deploy and the straightforward first way to start using the agricultural data is the United States Department of Agriculture. So USDA, they have the croplands starting in 2006. They collected surveys for the data, first on the county level, then even on the field level, and it's possible to know in a pretty high accuracy, so they claim up to 90% accuracy of the agricultural data. knowing where's growing what. So the map looks like this. It's possible to pull from it and to extract. And as you can see, it's detected on it's mapped on the pixel level. And for like 1 pixel is like 30 by 30 meters. It's possible to understand what is going there and to use it as a ground truth data for training. So the third part of the process is like really the engineering stuff. So the frameworks and algorithms. I probably want to give much examples because I don't have that much time, and every problem is different. So for example, if you do a two-class classification between corn and soybean in the region where it's known that it's just corn and soybean, the decision tree is just fine. When the moisture content should be analyzed, it is a more challenging task. When the multi-crops should be classified in a region like California, where there's such a variety of them, it's also like a more problem for AI rather than a problem for a decision tree. And for example, like another thing that the easiest thing to be analyzed is the finding active and inactive fields. So the fields which are being used this year and the fields which are idle. This can be done specifically just by looking at the indexes. Just numbers like no ML, no AI. Pretty straightforward, like first thing to make sure that everything of the data pipeline is there. And one of the most challenging parts of the methods is, again, as I said, is doing the infrastructure for analyzing massive pictures. It is costly, it's hard to scale. It requires some hacks. It requires not analyzing the whole pictures, but making the features out of them first. And I believe this is like the one piece which prevents from having global maps for crops. And I think that the most innovations in this field is going to happen specifically in this part, when it's become possible to analyze the whole world but not spending that much for processing. I will upload the slides, and this one just a repository for the links where to go and access all the listed open data sources I set for free, plus a couple of good introductions to how to start using the geographical data in some different applications, because agriculture looks like one of the most promising, the most exciting. Another ones is the forest monitoring, insurance, urban planning. They require a little bit, sometimes more higher resolution data, but the approach feels like the same, and the good and cheap and like free way to start is to use an open source data and try to extract most of it. Again, to wrap up, so with the current satellites, it's possible to understand what crops are growing, and to help to the supply chains and balancing the crop production from different countries, which is really important when the food prices should be agreed with stakeholders that have transparent access to data and know the same things. And using open source data is the best way to add this transparency to the food prices. And that's it. Any questions?
Hi, I was wondering, do you do anything with irrigation? Like, can you look at moisture content and weather and try to determine whether there's like a spike in moisture content, which you could infer irrigation?
This is like the moisture content with the satellite is a pretty challenging thing, because there's a parameter of the soil transmittivity, depending on how much of the water is within the upper 50 centimeters, and this one is detectable with the satellite. Everything which is going down, there's no satellite that can show it. Even the radar satellites have challenges. So I'd say that it's possible and it's doable, but to some certain limit. The best results are achieved with a combination of the satellites and the invasive soil sensors.
Thank you.
What does the flow look like if you guys, look using all your algorithms, find out that there's less soybean production, or one of the core products is being produced less this year in a particular country? how do you then go and achieve your goal of balancing crop production across countries?
So the challenge is to have the most frequent observations, to know when the food, what kind of food is going to be produced this year as earliest as possible. So hopefully by June or by July for the Northern Hemisphere, it is possible to understand what kind of food was produced, which means that for the Southern Hemisphere, it is the time when they buy seeds and understand what to crop this year. And thanks for the global different climates, so the seasons are changed a little bit in every country, and the way how they make these decisions, it also depend on. So currently, USDA makes one important annual report, and it happens I think in August. And this report impacts for many countries to decide on what seeds do they buy and what seeds do they put in the field. So the idea is to put this boundary a little bit earlier. Thank you.